This is going to be our 24th Barichara updates call. And what's so funny is that, a few weeks ago or a month or so ago, I said, we're going to call them Barichara and beyond because we'll be talking about the other bioregions we're working with. And today I'm going to almost not talk about Barichara at all because I'm mostly going to talk about our trip to the Ozarks and what it was, and contextualize it in this planetary network of bioregions that are self-organizing around what we're doing. Some of you were on our call yesterday where we had this profound, horizontal exchange between people who are organizing themselves in the Driftless region, which is basically part of the Mississippi River north of St. Louis that goes into part of Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And then what we're preparing for in the Toronto, Great Lakes areas. We gave, I think, praise to what Jonathan has been hosting with some Great Lakes bioregional exchanges that he's been in the last few weeks. Jonathan, you've been doing some beautiful work. I've been watching, I haven't gotten to watch all of the second one yet, although Benji and Penny are both like, I need to watch it because it's so good. And so I could tell in the first 20 minutes, I need to make some time. And we had a great call yesterday with Claire and Brandy and Darren and Megan about what we could be doing in the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, which then kind of goes outward into larger context of Cascadia and the Salish Sea. In the last couple of months, we've had a lot of focus on what's happening on the western slopes of Colorado because of our two visits to Paonia and to Carbondale and to the Front Range. And we know that there are inklings of something pulling us toward New Mexico with Bennett's help and with some other people, and we can feel the Colorado Basin. And so today what I want to do is give us a bit of that context of the continental activation patterns of how people in different places are weaving across neighboring bioregions. And even though it's very early days, we're already covering a lot of geography, so we can sort of feel the direction we're going. And then I want to go more deeply and spend most of the time sharing almost like family photos, back in the days when people had those slides and you do the actual slideshow of, and here we are in front of the grizzly bear, and here we are when it bit my we're gonna have like a family trip sort of sharing today, because I want to show you how Penny, Elise, and I blended our experiences of the amazing museums of Chicago with our immersion in the Ozarks. And I want to do this partly because the Ozarks is such a special bioregion, and partly because it's where I grew up. And I never really talk about where I grew up. And I was surprised to discover, after everything that's happened in the last 3 years in Barichara, but also the last 20 years, I left, I haven't really lived in Missouri since about the year 2001. And I haven't lived in the Ozarks, like where I grew up, since 1995. So for me to go back there with this much more clear sense of land connection, I discovered things about myself, and I want to share sort of like my bioregional journey into my own bioregion of my youth as it relates to what we're doing in the other places. So that's sort of the sense. But there's one thing that I'm going to name and not talk a lot about, which is I'm going to name that we're creating a design school for Earth regeneration, which is really in many ways the pattern language of what we've been doing throughout all of Earth Regenerators. It's actually on the back cover of this book that I wrote. It is what the idea of living out the design pathway would need to be. And it includes, as I will show concretely today, the immersion in natural history and paleontology, which is, we're going to see what it was like when Penny and I were connecting with the Field Museum in Chicago, which is one of the best, probably the best, natural history museum on Earth, and a place that has organized paleontology field research all over the planet for over 150 years. And so the Field Museum is sort of like the Oxford of natural history, as a place in Chicago that's truly a world-class institution, as a research institution and as public education through a museum that gets hundreds of thousands of visitors per year. And I'm going to blend these elements because what I want to start to convey is that it's sort of like the subtext we won't talk a lot about, but I want to foreshadow it to you before we start the slideshow, which is that the most important body of knowledge for designing the regeneration of Earth is actually Earth system science. And almost no one even knows what Earth system science is. So while people know about permaculture and landscape restoration and conservation biology and organic farming and various things that are definitely a part of this, that this Earth systems perspective is something that is relatively new, meaning it's really matured since the early 1970s with the first observational satellites. And we have moved forward in leaps and bounds so quickly that it's dizzying even to the Earth systems community. The only thing I'll name that we're all familiar with here is the planetary boundaries framework came out of the Earth system science community. Just to give you a sense of that is a realm of this knowledge that is highly useful for us already. But you'll see as I talk about the Ozarks, how I bring an Earth systems lens, just because I can't help it, because I'm an Earth system scientist. And that the idea of having a design school for regenerating the Earth is going to need to bring very clear connections between bioregions and larger planetary processes, like plate tectonics, glaciers, river formation, weather patterns, ocean mixing processes, the biogeography or the spread of species and ecosystem types, which are very important for how we connect across bioregions. And some of it is more obvious to sort of the uninitiated of Earth systems, and some of it is not obvious at all. Meaning, if you didn't learn something about planetary science, you would just be lost in the sense of how these things relate to each other, which I think is true for most people on Earth. I think there's very poor Earth science and Earth systems education in the US and everywhere on Earth. And so it's with that perspective that I want to tell a very concrete story, as you'll see in a moment. So I just want to jump right in. So let's go ahead and do that now. First thing I want to say is that, as you're about to see, this story is very personal to me. And I'm going to explain the significance of this picture. Because that's Elise sitting next to the stream where I grew up, spontaneously, without any prompts from me or Penny, singing a blessing to the river. Because she learned that in Barichara. And so there's something about this image that I'll convey the significance of later. But I just want to tell you that a dream was planted inside of me in this place that is being born right now in the Barichara Ecoversity. And I didn't understand where that dream was coming from until I took this picture, or really until the moment that this picture captures. The moment when I realized why I'm trying to bring rivers back to life and where that comes from. And so I'm going to tell part of that story today with the slideshow that I'll share. But first, I want to explain this image, because those of you who are in Earth Regenerators will recognize that big blue ball there as being what Earth Regenerators has been for the last 3 years, which is that we have been exploring the regeneration of the Earth through a lot of different lenses in a design orientation, meaning applying our knowledge to solve real problems, whether it's using pro-social to create effective groups, or bringing in trauma healing techniques, or looking at landscape management, or permaculture, or what have you. We have been practicing as a design school for regenerating Earth for several years now. And what has been making this really grounded and clear is all of the work in Barichara. And now that we have finished the purchase of Las Albercas, the land where the Barichara Ecoversity is being born, and the Barichara Ecoversity is about to make itself very visible in the next year, what is already happening and how it relates to this planetary learning process, that bioregional activators in the last few months, since October, has been flowing through the Design School for Regenerating Earth, primarily through bioregional catalysts and the work that Benji's done as part of Earth Regenerators, but really through many different places that go way beyond Earth Regenerators, like working with groups in the Web3 crypto space, working directly with Common Land Foundation or Pro-Social World, who are not explicitly part of Earth Regenerators, although we collaborate a lot with them indirectly, And we are catalyzing this congealing of bioregions to start forming a planetary network. And I just wanted the schematic diagram to show you that this is already happening and has been in process for several years. And I would say it involves all of you, whether you knew it or not. So like Jason being here from Doomer Optimist is interesting, because Jason will remember that he asked me to speak to his students back in 2020. And we were exploring some of these themes with his students in Appalachia. And so we were already connected in this learning ecosystem without it being visible what it was. And similar things could be said for other projects like Jeff being here and his connection with Commons Engine and community currencies and Holochain, and how Fernanda and Art Brock and these people from that space are going to become more visible in this work later, even though we haven't been explicitly collaborating. And indirectly, Jeff has been working with grassroots economics. Will Ruddick came to refi Barichara. All I'm doing is naming that there are lots of threads that are mostly invisible, but they're everywhere. They're everywhere throughout our activities. And we're forming clarity about how to organize it. And in the last 3.5 months, we have been supporting a pattern that is naturally organizing itself across continents. Within Barichara and to 6 other territories in Colombia through a network of territorial foundations. In the Colorado River Basin, starting in the headwaters in Rawlinsville, Paonia, and Carbondale, which represent an ecological corridor and 2 watersheds, the Roaring Fork River and the North Fork of the Gunnison River. But then they connect to the Front Range in Denver and Boulder, and the Colorado Basin is already weaving its way down into New Mexico. And so we're feeling this connection of something larger. The Driftless region, which is an area that was along the Mississippi River in the northern parts of the Midwest, which connects to the things that we'll talk about today in the Ozarks. The Great Lakes that are beginning to organize themselves primarily at this point in the greater Toronto area and in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Although Penny, Elise, and I going to Chicago and connecting to Lake Michigan there was just another thread. Chad Monfreda, who's really active in Earth Regenerators, is connected to things happening in Michigan. And there are other things in the Great Lakes region that are just beginning to reveal themselves. And then in the Salish Sea and the Cascadia area, focused primarily at this point on the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, but really connecting across the waters to Vancouver itself, where Megan is based, to a lot of people we know in Washington State, in Oregon, the Cascadia Independence Movement, people like Brandon Leitsinger, who's a dear friend of mine, and some of you may know him too. And we're forming these networks. And then there are lots of places that aren't named here, like Osa Peninsula, work that we will cultivate in Nicaragua and Honduras, and places that are yet to be seen on this map. But the thing that we can already start to see happening is that the design pathway for regenerating Earth, which is a planetary network of bioregional regenerative economies and bioregional learning centers, it is weaving itself into being right now in real time. And you can feel that in statements like this one. This is actually what is on the back cover of my book, is that the design pathway is its purpose is to give birth to regenerative bioregions. And these are the words that I wrote for the back cover of the book: to create a planet-wide network of learning ecosystems that is needed, that is capable of holding the complexity of birthing these regenerative bioregions during and after the rest of the collapse that we were all born into. And so this was named 2 years ago. And I'm just saying that what I'm sharing today is not new. It's just we're continually getting clearer at describing what we've been doing the whole time. And so that brings us to the Ozarks. For those of you who don't know what the Ozarks are, here's a map. You can see that they span 4 states because they barely touch Kansas. They go into Oklahoma a little bit. It's primarily in Missouri, but it goes into northern Arkansas. The Ozarks are a plateau. Sometimes they're called the Central Highlands of North America because between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, it's the Great Plains. And then the first highlands is the Ozarks Plateau, where you start to get into different kinds of topography. And the Ozarks is an ancient mountain range that is almost 500 million years old. And it's now sort of eroded to the point of being a plateau. And the important thing to note is that this has the highest concentration of caves on Earth. There are 7,600 registered caves in Missouri. I don't know the number for Arkansas, but just think the Ozarks includes more than 7,600 registered caves. The only other state in the United States with a similar number of caves is Tennessee, because there are parts of Appalachia that have similar sandstone and dolomite structures. But what makes this an important bioregion is in two ways. One is the first ever bioregional Congress was organized in 1978 in the Ozarks, centered around Springfield, and they are about to have their 45th. They've been doing it for 45 straight years. So the Ozarks is a bioregion among bioregions within the history of bioregionalism. And that's where I grew up, kind of halfway between Joplin and Branson, down in the countryside. And I want to show you the place of my childhood. But to do that, let's begin the journey. It started with Elise and me traveling from Barichara to the Chicago area to visit Jessica's parents. And then Penny came and joined us there for Christmas, and we got to experience snow and play and have fun. It was frickin' cold, like minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chills because of a big storm that came through, but we still had a nice time. And what we did while we were there was we took Elise to the Shed Aquarium because of something that I know about planetary collapse, which is that my daughter will probably never see a healthy coral reef in her life. As some of you know, the Great Barrier Reef has been collapsing precipitously in the last 10 years. There was a bleaching event that covered 60% of the Great Barrier Reef, and that all of the reefs on Earth are in decline. And because of ocean acidification, basically the melting of the coral reefs is beginning to occur through a chemical process associated with ocean acidification. And the current estimates are that there will be no coral anywhere in the ocean. I'm not talking living coral reefs. I mean, the coral will have dissolved by about 2070 due to ocean acidification, which means all of the coral reefs on Earth are dying and will soon be gone. And my daughter will probably never see one. So I took her to a coral reef system at the Shed Aquarium in Chicago. Think about that. For me to teach my daughter about coral reefs, I took her to Lake Michigan in the Midwestern United States, 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. Because I know that I've visited other coral reefs and they're all bleached and mostly dead. And so that brings us to a very important part of the journey. How do children learn about what has already been lost? And for me to take my daughter to an aquarium to learn about living ecosystems, because the living ecosystems in the wild are almost all gone. Okay, well, now she could still go to some barrier reefs that look healthy, but in 10 years, no, children will not be able to do that. And so I'm already thinking ahead about these planetary processes. So when Penny and I took Elise to the aquarium, we laughed, we had fun, we saw awesome jellyfish. Here's Elise checking out the sharks. It was really fun. And the undertone of it was that Penny and I knew that this is planetary collapse education. We didn't traumatize Elise about the coral reefs dying, but we wanted her to experience coral reefs because we bring a planetary collapse lens to ourselves as parents. And also the week before, Elise is right there on the left, sitting with an indigenous wisdom holder from the Muisca tradition. As part of a 5-day process they were just finishing to bring back the dead river of the Barichara River. And so Elise is participating in watershed restoration in Barichara. So my child is coming from dead rivers and restoration processes like this to seeing coral reefs in Chicago. And this is important to name that while we were in Chicago at Shed Aquarium, there's no Barichara to be seen, except that it's in the bodies and the minds and the hearts of Elise, Penny, and me. Because of what, Elise is turning 6 this Saturday. And she arrived in Barichara when she was almost 3. Half of her life has been immersed in landscape regeneration in Barichara. So of course she's going to bring that to the Shed Aquarium, whether she knows it or not. She's almost 6. She doesn't know what kind of an education she's getting. But I know that the coral reefs of the world collapsing are connected to the dead rivers in the Andes. I know it because I have an Earth systems perspective. And then there was a weird thing that happened where when Penny and I went to the Field Museum, Elise didn't go. Family drama, all kinds of stuff about the grandmother wanting time with Elise. We took Elise back to the Field Museum at the end of our trip. But there was a day when Penny and I went, and we walked through what I consider to be probably the best museum exhibit on Earth. It's called The Evolving Planet, and it tells the 3.8 billion year history of life on Earth, including passing through mass extinction events from one geologic era to another. And what I want to name here is that this geologic perspective of deep time is what guides everything that Penny and I do. Everything we do. Why are we going all over the world and traveling right now? Because we have a deep time perspective. Why do we go to places like the Field Museum and the Shedd Aquarium? Because we have a deep time perspective. And so to visit the 5 previous mass extinction events and place ourselves in this context before visiting the Ozarks helped us arrive there with the right mindset. And I just want you to look at this. This is a fossil of a fish from 450 million years ago. Look at it. You can see the texture on its scales. That's how good the fossil collection is at the Field Museum in Chicago. 450 million years old, and you can see the scales on the skin of a fish's fossil embedded in rock. This is before dinosaurs. This is between the 2nd and 3rd mass extinction event. Here is a living fossil for us. It's behind glass, but I can just imagine touching it. I want to run my fingers across it. I actually don't, because I don't want to damage the fossil, but that's a real fossil. That's not a replica of a fossil. That's a real fossil. The Field Museum has a collection that is unprecedented on Earth. So to look at a fish like this, and then later to see the first amphibians from 300 million years ago coming onto land, to see the Carboniferous forest that made all of the fossil fuels we're depleting today, to see the largest Tyrannosaurus, whose name is Sue, that's 50 feet from head to tail. This is a Tyrannosaurus that was found in South Dakota. About 80% of these bones are the actual fossil bones. The biggest one that is not is the head. The actual fossil's in the other room, but they didn't want to have to dismount it and remount it for the amount of research they actively do on it. So they actually made a clay mold of it. Also, the living fossil's head weighs 600 pounds, or about 200 kilometers or 200 kilograms. And so it weighs a lot to mount it and dismount it. And for us to be in the presence of these dinosaurs and these fossils and these epochs of mass extinctions enabled us to hold this. This is how that exhibit ends. That we're in the 6th mass extinction. Here it says it's human caused, 10,000 years ago to today. And why is it happening? Us. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species is the primary cause of a mass extinction. Humans are changing the planet in ways that are causing species to die out faster than ever. And here's a photograph where they have every 15 minutes, there's a new extinction. Every 15 minutes. And the day we were there had been 23 species that went extinct between 8 a.m. and the time I took this photograph. So to sit in the presence of this is to be an Earth systems thinker. And it was this that enabled us to drive across northern Illinois and see these wind turbines and think, oh, fuck, they're turning the alluvial floodplains of the rivers of North America into a giant machine and a giant battery to keep the life supports of our dying civilization going, to wreak even more havoc on the Earth's biosphere for a little bit longer, because we're already in ecological overshoot. And that's what I see when I see these wind turbines. So that we could arrive into something like this. This is Merrimack Caverns, which is a 16-mile long underground cavern system in Missouri, about an hour west of St. Louis. It may be hard to tell in this picture, but what you see there is a river, and the water is so clear you almost can't see there's water there. This is water that is percolated through the sandstone and dolomite structures above and is seeping out as a river. the 16-mile-long cavern that is so clean and so pure you could drink that water with your hands. And this is part of a 440 million year geologic process that started with an ancient ocean back before all of North America had formed into a continent, when the interior part of North America was an inland ocean, which led to the laying down of all the sandstone from all the ancient seashores that built up to eventually, through plate tectonics and continental uplift, to create an ancient mountain range even older than the Appalachians. The Appalachians are about 460 million years old, if I remember correctly. And the Appalachians were as large as the Himalayas at their time, the height of their time. And the Ozarks were part of that mountain range that has been eroding for 400 million years to form this cavern network of caves that is the Ozarks. There on the left is Penny and Elise walking on a path to give you a sense of the scale of the underground river. And what I want you to realize here is that to see the Ozarks, you need to go below ground, because you can't really understand the Ozarks unless you understand the geology in these cave systems. And you'll see the importance of that in a moment for conservation of surface rivers. But these are living caves, and there's still parts of the cave with amazing stalagmite and stalactite structures like this one you see here. And you can see, I took this picture so you could get a sense of the scale of it with Elise next to it. And as we're looking at these things, there's like an auditorium inside the cave with all these rock formations. And so our entrance into the Ozarks was to prepare with a deep time Earth systems perspective in Chicago's museums, and then to enter the Ozarks and go into a cave so that we could look at things like this and understand them. Roaring River State Park, which is one of the largest fisheries in North America, where a lot of rainbow trout are restocked into the rivers, is an important place for us to know about because it is fed by a spring that comes out of a cave. An underground river is what enables us to restock the rivers of North America with all of the overfished rivers. And by the way, Roaring River State Park has been restocking fish for about 100 years. This is one of the restocking pools where they put some of the larger rainbow trout that are cultivated here. If you look at the next picture, if it's loading slowly, why is it loading slowly? That this is one of the channels. All of the water in this channel is from a spring. And you can see the little fins of about maybe 300,000 fish that are in this channel. They're being prepared to grow large enough to take them off to different rivers across the United States and restock the rivers. And this is the spring that feeds the whole system. This is the deepest known spring in North America. They've now been able to go down about 450 feet. A diver lost his life last year because every couple of years, divers try to go further and get deeper into this cavern spring system to find their way to its origin, and they've yet to do it. And a diver lost his life when 2 divers went down last year trying to get farther into the spring system. Look at the amount of water coming out of that spring. That spring is enabling the entire fish hatchery of Roaring River State Park. But then you go about 25 miles away to Neosho, Missouri, a little town, and you'll find the oldest fish hatchery in the United States, founded in 1888. And that is the spring that feeds it. It's gravity-fed spring, where water flows out of a spring, flows downhill into a series of holding tanks, growing about 4 million river trout per year to restock rivers 1,000 miles away in every direction. They restock rivers in Montana, in Colorado, in Wisconsin, in Tennessee. Basically, like a half of the continental United States gets its river fish restocked from Neosho's Fish Hatchery and Roaring River State Park, both of which are fed by springs. And then a mile away in Neosho is this spring. This is Big Spring. See the water coming out of the hillside, that waterfall? That's a spring. There's not a surface spring above it. Look at it and you'll see there are those trees above there. That is water flowing out of the ground. This is what it looks like on the left. The water seeps out of a cavern, goes back into the rocks, comes out of that waterfall, and then flows away in the stream you see on the right. That is the volume of flow of water from a spring a mile away, less than a mile away from the fish hatchery, which has a similar flow. And what I'm telling you here is that the Ozarks is a place of underground rivers that are beautifully clear and healthy, even to this day, because of all of the filtering that the rocks have done. So while many rivers are contaminated all over the world, I have this feeling in my body that rivers should be pure and clean, that I should be able to dip my mouth right into them and drink from them. Because you can still do that to this day in many of these streams in Missouri. Which brings us to another part of my story. This is the house that I grew up in. Someone built this garage on there on the left. That didn't exist when I was there. But I want you to notice that I grew up underground. I grew up in a cave. My dad built this house as a bomb shelter for the Cold War, and I lived inside of a cave. And in that cave, I found sanctuary by going to a nearby stream that I could drink from. We'll get to that in a moment. Right next to the house I grew up in, about, I don't know, a tenth of a mile away, is a Civil War era cemetery that I visited a lot when I was a kid. We'd cross this fence on our neighbor's land. That's Penny and that's my sister Sarah climbing over the fence. Elise is about to climb over it too. So we'd go to this old cemetery so that we could relate to the cultural history of this place. And when you go to a Civil War era cemetery, you feel into the history of violence and intergenerational trauma just by reading the stories on the tombstones. Like this one. Look at this. This child was born on January 21st of 1860 and died on December 18th of the same year. This child died after less than a year. When I was a kid, I would go and look at tombstones like this one and this exact tombstone, and I would ponder life and death. And when I was depressed and suicidal, I would come and visit these tombstones and wonder, what would it be like to never have lived like this child? There's actually a tombstone a few feet away of a child that was stillborn, that the birth date and the death date is the same day. And then there's this. Here are 47 headstones for a group of young people who died during the Civil War, all of them between about the age of 15 and 25. And just leaves me to ponder when I look at this mass grave, what happened to all the people who died here? A little known bit of the history of Missouri is that Missouri had more battles during the Civil War than all of the rest of the United States together. There were about 30,000 battles during the Civil War in total, and 20,000 of them, 20,000, happened in the Ozarks in Missouri. And Missouri was forced to be a free state as part of one of the great compromises, which meant that the slaveholders from this part of the Ozarks, who were slaveholders and fundamentalist Christians, they departed because they didn't want to live in a free state. And they moved to Plano, Texas, which is pretty close by. And they invented a false history saying that the South never lost the Civil War. And they founded a very famous club, the Ku Klux Klan. The people who to this day try to perpetuate stories of structural racism and white supremacy shrouded in the story of Christianity. They were from this place of intense violence in the mid-1800s. Can you imagine 20,000 battles in the span of 4 years? This is the place where brothers killed brothers and neighbors killed neighbors like no other place on earth. Which brings us back to a connection to Barichara, because Barichara and its neighboring village of Villanueva were the most violent place during the same time from about, 100 years later, from about 1950 to about 1980, Barichara and Villanueva were the most violent place in Colombia's violent history, where neighbors murdered neighbors on the street in a way that was very similar to the Civil War in Missouri in the 1860s. And so I can feel these connections. I can appreciate the violence of Barichara because I explored the violence of Missouri. I didn't realize that consciously until I came back to this cemetery. And then we went to this place. May not look like much, it's just a pretty little creek, right? But this is Joy Creek. This is the creek that flows across the farm where I grew up. This is the place that I went when kids bullied me and I wanted to be alone. And I wondered why everyone was so mean to each other. When my parents got divorced and I needed time to myself, when I couldn't connect with people, but I could connect with nature, I went to this creek and I found sanctuary there. So it was really powerful for me when I saw Elise learning to skip rocks, when I just watched Penny looking at the land and feeling the significance of this creek. Which brings us to something very powerful. See, living memories of the past are in the tactile senses of our bodies. I had forgotten about these little river mollusks until I dipped my hand into the stream and picked one up again. And I had a flood of memories of more than 10 years playing in this creek, of picking up rocks like this, of catching crawdads with my hands, of going fishing. And that's when it hit me. Elise is giving blessings to this stream because I planted in her my dream of her having a stream like this. When I went looking for the place where a river had died and I could bring it back, my mental model was this stream. I wanted all of the children of Barichara to have a stream with clear waters that they could drink from with their hands, and they could discover the life of the rivers. And that's what compelled me to connect with Las Albercas. That's what brought me to birthing the Ecoversity. And I didn't know it until I felt it in my bones while Elise was singing to Joy Creek. So this bioregional journey into ourselves, away from our homelands and back again, is part of the story of Earth regeneration. And so as we weave this tapestry of regeneration across the planet, there's a question, which is, how does something like the Barichara Ecoversity already embody the integration of other bioregions? And what you can see from what I just shared is that I brought the Ozarks. I brought the Ozarks to the Northern Andes. And then I brought the Northern Andes to the Ozarks in the living flesh of my child. Because my child has spent the first 3 years of her life traveling around, the second 3 years of her life in Barichara, and now she knows she has family and history in the Ozarks. And as we weave this tapestry of bioregional networks, we're going to find over and over again that it is our bodies that connect, but only if we have a planetary story, which is what Earth systems gives us. It gives us a way of seeing these planetary connections in clear and concrete terms. And so that's what I want to talk with you all about, is how are we naturally weaving a tapestry within our own hearts and across our landscapes in the work that we're doing. And so as you can see, the idea here is that we need 3 elements. We need to understand the planetary collapse is happening to know what to prioritize. I knew that I needed to take Elise to see coral reefs in Chicago because chances are pretty good I'm never going to take her to a living coral reef in the wild. Now, I might be wrong and I might get lucky and have the privilege of taking her to one, but there's very little time left. And that if we hadn't gone to the Field Museum, Penny and I would not have prepared ourselves. Also, for those of you who saw it a few weeks ago, Penny and I went to Southern Utah, which was a similar journey into deep time in Earth history to prepare us for what we were doing in the Western slopes of Colorado. That all of us need to be doing these spiritual sojourns into Earth history to bring back to our bioregions. So the planetary collapse story tells us what is sacred. I know that coral reefs are sacred. I know those dinosaurs and those fish fossils are sacred. Because I have Brian Swim's big history story. You know, I have these stories in my body. And then as we journey from one bioregion to another, the landscapes speak to us. The Ozarks are so different from the Western slopes of Colorado. Thank goodness. There are all these personalities of landscapes. We're about to go to Toronto. I don't even know what's going to be awakened in me when I go to Toronto. But I know that when Brian and Susan said why they wanted us to come, you know what Brian said? He said, Joe, I want to know what your eyes see. when you look at this landscape. So there's something about this way of showing up. And so I'd love to open it up now to discussion. What does it mean to be Barichara and beyond? What does it mean to live into the regeneration of bioregions as we're weaving them across continents already? It's very early days, but we are doing it. What does it mean to replace universities with this kind of education, with bioregional learning centers and ecoversities and landscape partnerships and territorial foundations and a lot of the things we've talked about in the last several months? And what does it mean to immerse ourselves in landscapes so that they can teach us what no human can? Like, I could not share with you what I was just sharing without being a guide from the Ozarks. The Ozarks has something to teach you. And I happen to be a spokesperson for the Ozarks today, just like I'm normally a spokesperson for Barichara. So that's what I want to open up and invite. If you could just raise your hand if you have a comment or a question you'd like to share. Stan, welcome, and please.
Oh, I love the, first of all, beautiful pictures, beautiful stories, and authenticity, I think, of a regeneration. I think, the stories of you and Barichara have always sort of felt foreign. But the stories of you and your daughter visiting and revisiting the historic family sites, that are as simple as the flow of the water and how it's evolved. And some of it's, underground, and some of it's still clean, and some of it could have been dirty, and fish hatcheries are, something for the wild salmon we have in the Northwest, but they're viewed as negative because they're not giving us the biodiversity chances that we have. So these are really interesting examples of regeneration. And I think at the heart of it, these stories. So the other interesting thing about our extinction events is because of the extinction events, we've all passed through a version of the Ozarks. So my family's from the Ozarks. And we came to the West from the Ozarks instead of Plano, Texas, and have people in those cemeteries. So that's a very authentic story. And then most of us came out of Africa, right? So we don't really know, but we all share these same kind of traumas and evolution. So I love this as an example of regeneration. And of course, the fossil, there have been a lot of extinction events, and man, it's pretty cool. And we get to participate in appreciating it. So that's, in some ways hopeful.
Yeah, it was something
we can see.
Penny said something about that, like to actually experience the structure of a timeline, because the Evolving Planet exhibit walks you through the history of the Earth with little markers on the ground of how far back in time. And then there are transition rooms for every mass extinction. And Penny was like, wow, there have been a lot of mass extinctions. Like, you sort of know it in a way, but basically most people don't know mass extinctions are a phenomenon of multicellularity. Once multicellular organisms came into being, about once every 100 million years, there's been a mass extinction. Multicellularity is 750 million years old. There have been 5. That's about 1 every 100 million years.
And the same thing with civilizations. A lot of civilizations have died, but we're still here. The human species has evolved. Anyway, I love this set of patterns and language and storytelling. And I think at the, characterizing that the Earth regeneration is a pattern of language and cultural evolution. It's great to be able to feel these stories. And then I think being able to share it with your family is really a very authentic test. And so I really love having that as more of our framing, more of our cultural story, because that's, I think, the hardest, if your daughter is picking up the stories, that gives you the feeling that the cultural evolution
absolutely
is really there.
No,
so
thank
anyways,
you.
that's a thank you.
No, thank you, Stan. And I feel our family's connections even more clearly now. I'd love to pass it on to Richard.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, Joe, just you sharing about deep time just brought me back to when I shared the other week about running through an ancient woodland and the flash of white chalk just reaching out to me, and just thinking back, this was formed like between 99 and 65 million years ago, and that was calling out to me. And I've been curious about that since, and just exploring my region and kind of learning something that links back to my childhood, where I live near Reading in the UK. Looking at one way of sort of the landscape, it might include the Chiltern Hills, which is, all of this ancient chalk. And if it does, then that links back to where I grew up in a small village called Wendover in the Chiltern Hills, the highest point in the Chiltern Hills. And it's just funny how that connection between now and then links back, and so many happy memories for me, like you sitting by the stream. For me, it was in the woodlands there, and just going off all day on my bike and just being in the woods and just happy and free, and that's where I love to go these days. Yeah, so all these things, and just seeing things differently, just seeing the landscape sort of change as I walk out of my region towards Reading, where the land goes flatter and the landscape's different. So yeah, thank you all just for giving this new perspective on things and seeing things. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And on to you, Grace.
Yeah, I find this whole conversation extremely confronting and triggering about place. And it started when listening to Joe talking one of the things about like, where do you want to put your bones, and I'm like, who cares? But I think about this. I mean, when you talk about collapse, and I've never really framed it in terms of collapse, but my work in looking at alternative economics and alternative democracies and alternative forms of human organization have been rooted in losing my country twice to economic collapse, to economic waves of things that I just couldn't live with, that seemed to go against the ethos of what I thought that I had been brought up that nation was about in both cases. And somebody actually Jeff was actually there, somebody was inviting me, like, would you like to come home to invite me to a conference in Tel Aviv? And it's very clear to me that that's my home, but it's also clear to me that I'm never going to live there again. And the conversation about water is really confronting. I was born in Boston. I grew up mostly in the New York area. I actually, a chunk of my childhood was in St. Louis. And I moved to Israel, and water is a really interesting issue over there. And 70% of the water is desalinated water. And it's like, oh, well, that's all based on electric, which is almost all coal, actually, now gas. And it's like this. And I moved somewhere with a lot of water. Like that was my thing. Like, it's got to have water. But also it has to have more like a system of thinking about governance and money that is more based in the people, not like people don't look to the government to do stuff for them because they're not going to. So I don't know. It's just very confronting. Like, what is the thread that runs through this, and where do I? And being a Jew, it's like, well, you're the people who wander all over the place. It makes sense that I'm not grounded in that way. But I feel like the travels and the way you shared it and the threads that run through it are starting to help me make sense of my experience and why it's not exactly grounded, and what I want to be doing within this group and how it all fits in. So I find myself very confronted and very inspired.
Well, I just want to say, one of the ways I've started to find myself, like talking about myself among people in Colombia, because there's so many indigenous cultures there, is I started describing myself as a lost child. Like a lost child in the sense of, I don't know my ancestors. I don't know my indigenous origins. They're lost. I come from conquered peoples instead of I come from civilization. And it hadn't occurred to me that I could do this. It's this ironically or paradoxically positive framing. Because being a lost child means I'm from somewhere, I just have lost it. So it's like an implied not lost, it's an implied positive. And it really was a healing step for me. Like recognizing that I was finding indigeneity, but in different landscapes, because I don't know the indigeneity of my own. I don't even know what my own indigenous landscapes were. But I could find indigeneity because it's so human to connect to landscapes. And so it's so human to connect to a place we're from. Like it's a really deep thing that humans, we co-evolved with landscapes. So it's a lot of this incoherence or things that don't work for us, don't make sense, is because so much violence, so much intergenerational violence has occurred. And the Hebrew history and the Jewish history is like a history of just, one affront of genocide after another. So I could see why that would be so challenging. Or I don't even know, my mom liked to imagine, being from Italy, that maybe she came from the Gypsies, partly somewhere, which would be almost like being from the Jews. It's like, there's a group of displaced people that I might be part of, but I don't know. And we're like so lost, we don't even know that we don't know. Like, it's really a big deal. So I just want to appreciate that, like really feel that with you. So thank you for sharing. And then on to Stephen.
So, yeah, I don't know if I have a coherent thought here exactly, but one thing, thanks, your stories before today, even when you're starting to talk about your journeys, brought back to mind. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and there was a particular undeveloped piece of land in my neighborhood that had a little creek, if you could call it that, even running through it. And it just brings back fond memories of going there to play with my friends. So I appreciate that being triggered. And listening to other people share about the impact of your stories really brought home for me Nora Bateson's whole teaching about warm data. Mm-hmm. It won't be the numbers. Scaring people with numbers will not change people. It'll be stories like this. Mm. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Stephen. I totally agree. On to you, Claire.
Do I press unmute myself? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And also your comments there, Stephen. So I grew up in South Africa, and this sort of brought this up for me as you were speaking. Was my dad was a botanist. We were often out in the field. We went on a lot of lots of animal parks, safaris, that kind of thing. Most of the time it was in a car. And then in my sort of late teens, we went to we stayed in a bush camp, and there was an animal tracker, and we'd get up sort of at 4 a.m. and to track the rhino and the just all of the other animals. And for the first time, I realized, as we were sort of paying attention, being pointed out that the different things like the wet mud rubbed on the trees and the insects, there was a paying attention to the smells, the sounds, the disturbances that were happening to birds sort of over there, that there was things that I had never paid attention to before. And I realized that all of the other many trips into game parks were like this pseudo kind of idea of having been near this wildlife experience that completely was not a wildlife experience because it was so separate from me. And I was privileged because I'd been more than a lot of my peers. And I realized that the world we live in the sort of Western industrialized rich world, we're living these sort of pseudo experiences of what we think is real. And if you think about it in terms of the kind of arts that have come out of that, because the arts kind of pull together the threads that are running through the culture. If it's been built off of a pseudo kind of platform, it distances you that much further from what we access as real. And I'm a textile artist. I really pay attention to textiles, fibers. And we were reading a chapter in Robin Wool Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, on these basket weavers who were weaving the baskets out of black ash. And this elder who's doing the teaching of basket weaving said, 80% of the work starts long before we even start to weave, because there's the choosing of the tree, there's the knowing when the right time was, there's the preparing, it's the sounds in the community of the thunk, thunk, thunk while you're sort of preparing the wood to be able to take the strips off the bark. Anyway, it just, I just realized that we're not even aware of how unaware we are, because the cultural stuff that's grown out anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. And it's the clothing we wear, it's against our skins. We have no idea where those fibers are from. There's no relationship. And just wanted to kind of bring that in, and just to say thank you for the awareness you're bringing and just the desire to learn. And I love what Brian said to you. I'd love to see through your eyes and others who are seeing like that can help wake me up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that when I was watching that interview between William Reese and Nate Higgins that you had shared on Twitter, there was a comment that Bill, I know both of them. I know Bill Reese and I know Nate Higgins. And there's a comment that Bill said that was really powerful, which was he said that cities break us from our ecological reality in two ways. Psychologically, they separate us because all of our experiences are directly in this artificial environment that pretends the rest of nature doesn't matter. You don't know where your clothes come from. You never visit those ecosystems. There's a psychological barrier. And then there's a physical material flow barrier, which is that you don't actually go and experience how much of the city is actually from the degradation of other land. And that it's like, 100 times the land area of a city is what must be destroyed for a city to exist. And things like this. And then people are just completely unaware of this if they are only in cities. And that this is a really huge challenge for enabling the kind of eco-literacy that's needed, which is just another version of what you're saying, that we're so unaware of the selecting of the plant and the whole process that leads to clothing. Although here in Barichara, I've seen workshops where we go out and we select the seeds, we grow the plant, like they're doing all of that here in Barichara. So my daughter is getting to experience it. And I'm like, all children need to experience this. They need to experience their own version of this. So that I really, really feel what you're saying. And now on to Gail. Hi, Gail.
Hi there. I'm just going to repeat stuff you've already heard me say, Joe, but maybe for some people it'll be new, which is, I'm born and bred in New York City. Born in the Bronx, grew up in Queens. And so, New York is very much home for me. And so, when Grace, you talked about being triggered, I get triggered in other ways because I'm in the city. And the city, in the scheme of things, is not a great place, right? With what's happening with collapse. I'm very curious to see what happens in Toronto. And if there's anything I can, I already know some examples from there from Shane, who talked about the Homegrown National Park. They don't call it that, but the attempt to get more people to plant native in their backyard. And as you know, I'm trying to get that going here in Queens with very little time. I don't have much time I can devote to it, but I did create a flyer. And I printed out 75 and went up and down my block and put it in every mailbox on my block. And it included my email address. And one person emailed me about it, but I'm hoping that I'm planting seeds, pun intended, to make people think that when they are going to work on their gardens, and everyone in this neighborhood has backyards. It's a very lovely suburban type neighborhood. Maybe they'll think twice about what they plant. And I do intend, I haven't gotten to it yet though, to reach out to our local council person and a couple of local NGOs to see if they want to get involved at all in encouraging this, because I just feel like, I'm not going to be able to do what you guys are doing in Barichara. I just don't live in that kind of place. So if I could at least create a green corridor for monarch butterflies and some of the birds and the bees and some of the other smaller creatures that live in areas like this, I feel like I will have made some kind of a difference that matters, and maybe help my city survive what's coming, because I'd like it to survive, if at all possible. Or, the people I love, the people I know, and the neighborhoods. I have the same kind of memories you have. I didn't have a creek I could go to when I was little, but I had a back area I would play in, and the block was my world. We go around on our bikes, and I had a tree in front of my house that I would sit on the grass in front of the tree. So I have the same kind of positive feelings about places like that where I grew up.
Yeah, I was thinking of two things. One is where you're talking about of increasing awareness for native plants would become a really powerful community mural art project if there was a place like a church with a visible wall or something that a local school could do. Just to say something like that could be very effective as just an ongoing reminder where they actually study the native plants and native ecology. Like, what did our block look like before there was a city here, and make it visual through art with descriptions, or maybe like a square link, like a QR code that would go to a website and give more information or whatever. So that's just a thought if you do ever talk to the city council. And then the second was the idea of a pollinator city, which is something that our friend Diana is learning about here in Barichara. So there are a lot of places now that are learning to be pollinator cities where they collaborate to bring back the native pollinators by doing basically microecological corridors within cities. And that it would be a beautiful thing, again, to connect with like schools and church groups.
I like that second one particularly. I don't know if I have the bandwidth for the first, but who knows? I do know an NGO that does murals in the city, so I could see if they'd be interested. But the other thing is I'm getting a sign. I already had it made to put in my yard, that I got it through Doug Tallamy's site, the Homegrown National Park site, that says, I'm on the map. He has a map on the site where you can put your garden. I already did that. Go native, and it has their website. So I'm going to have that in my front yard. Anyone who walks by or drives by will see it. So that's a similar kind of idea to that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then the other thing, just quickly to say, is that one of the kinds of composting we need to do is we need to compost neoliberal capitalism. And one way that we can do that is that cities are resource rich in economic terms at the moment. And there's a real need for that to be transferred into creating commons-based land and other projects, the urban-rural co-development transfers of protecting land from urban development. And there's a lot to be said about that element as well, that a place like New York, which is like an economic powerhouse for good and ill, right? It's in both directions. But a lot of conscientious people that, as Willem Verweerde showed when he created Common Land Foundation, they lack the eco-literacy to know how to donate their money or to invest it, which is why he's worked so hard to create shared language for basically it's like eco-idiot investing. Common Land Foundation has tried to create really simple language, like the 4 returns, because they know that the people who would invest in these impacts don't know enough ecology to invest intelligently. And for his background in conservation and biodiversity, he knows that helping them get there is a big deal. Unlocking some of the philanthropic money from Scandinavia is part of what he's done with Common Land Foundation by creating simplistic language, because he knows that he's sort of nice about it. He's like, they're ecological idiots. I talk to them, their eyes glazed over after you say species, So trying to get to biodiversity is an uphill battle for an investor. And he's smart enough and savvy enough to just be playful about it, and has made a lot of headway. So just to name that element too, that cities can have a role to play in the rewilding of the rest of nature through a lot of exchanges, even if cities ultimately are never sustainable, even if it's a transition strategy. So just recognizing that there are many levels, and we will be dancing in those paradoxes continuously in Toronto.
And thank
No
you
doubt.
for those 3 great ideas. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. All right, back to you, Stan.
Oh, well, I love the evolution of the stories and the patterns, and actually the England cliffs with the little pebble reminded me of sort of the deep time story of I was at Christmas with my dad, and we were sharing the family stories, going back to independence. I was telling about the regenerative stuff, and he said, well, our family actually came out of England. And he was telling me about the people that got kicked out of England before they got kicked out of independence. And I think, that cultural evolution goes back to what Gail was saying about clothing. A lot of our industry came from England around wool, and a lot of the family were sheep ranchers. And so we still, as a family, not only go visit the places, but go reenact, not only the fishing kind of stories and the farming kind of stories around apple seeds from England, but also the sheep and the wool harvest events around shearing and weaving. And so we actually have festivals that are the old farming with horses and the old shearing of sheep and building of spinning of the fiber and looming of the fabric. And Pendleton wool is here in Cascadia, and the sweaters in the Olympics are raised on the Imperial Sheep Ranch in the Deschutes River Valley. And then there's the heritage of the old sheeps and the patterns of how those weaves evolved in Scotland and became 2-pocket shirts that people wear here in the Northwest. And I think these whole cultural evolutions are so important, and the deep time framing gives us a chance to come through the common natural selection processes of getting kicked out of England, getting kicked out of independence, nearly surviving, and having that biodiversity come back richer and be available as a rich pattern language. And like Gail said, in New York City, we have, Audubon backyards and signs in our yards, and it's respecting the bird migration. Actually, I was so proud at Christmas that my 3-year-old granddaughter was sitting at the kitchen table, and we saw this orange flash knocking the snow off of a tree right above the kitchen table. And she just yelled. I was thinking of some robin, but she said variegated thrush. She's 3 years old. I couldn't understand what she said, but that's a rare bird.
Yeah,
That's
one
a
of the
lot of
things,
syllables, but I think this is the pattern language that becomes regenerative, and I think it's these are really powerful. I agree with what Steve said. It's the patterns. It's these stories.
yeah,
And so thanks everyone for this. I think it gives us the feeling of regeneration, and we're coming through a tough natural selection process.
yeah.
But
One thing
we
that
have a biodiversity of stories. It's going to be wonderful.
one thing that's really powerful about cultural evolution, and I know from having mapped the different fields of cultural evolution, is there is a lot of co-evolution that occurs. For example, landscape type and language structure is a very well-known thing in language evolution. And then there's biogeography, which is ecosystem types or ecozone or ecoregion types that evolve around geologic patterns and climatic patterns, which means you can transfer knowledge from one bioregion to another along these coherent or convergent evolutionary processes. But most people don't study cultural evolution, so they don't know this. But it's going to be really interesting to take an Earth systems lens to bring cultural evolution in as part of it.
Oh,
Is really
the migratory species are a really interesting cross connect between these places.
Yeah,
Especially the evolution of the horse changed the whole culture of the English pattern language. The whole phonetic language set was enabled by the horse, and those that didn't have it right away stayed with the visual patterns that, so the Indo-European, so that, perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful.
So just recognizing it, I would say everything in human culture is a subset of Earth system science because it's a subset of evolution, which is a subset of living systems, which is a subset of the Earth's biosphere, which is a subset of the Earth system. And it's just restructuring our cosmovisions to see that. And I'm really curious, what does Bennett have to share? You've been patiently waiting.
Yeah. I wanted to say thank you for bringing such your unique perspective and like that deep rootedness you have in that place of the Ozarks, because I grew up on the edge of the Ozarks in Tulsa. My mom's from Kansas City, the urban edge, kind of right on the cusp of it, but not actually being from the place, from being in this manufactured environment. And it really took like some ego destabilizing experiences in my youth to realize like, oh, this is just deeply wrong. And that like one thread that led me to studying earth sciences and led me to gaining this like larger understanding and feeling the pull to go to these different landscapes and sort of try to understand what was being asked or what was being said there. I think that's just like a very big part of my story that I didn't necessarily have the words for, and just your way of like cutting straight through to the heart of the matter and being able to articulate it so well, and specifically coming from that place is just, yeah, that sense of being lost and acknowledging it, and like and really being like, okay, well, I don't know what my deep rooted connection to my people are, so I must go out and like connect directly with the land and re-indigenize that way. Is just like yeah, that's it right there. So I just wanted to say thank you for articulating that so well, and yeah.
Thank you, Bennett. And I just want to say, as we start a closing, that it was really powerful for me to have Penny as a mirror, because she was like, oh, that's why you're that way. You're from Missouri. Oh, that's a Missouri thing. Like, oh, everyone here talks like that. Oh, okay, I see it. And, I had a sense for a while that my pragmatism, my directness, and my skepticism of people using big words, even though I'm totally a nerd, and I fell into that for a while, all comes from my Missouri sensibility, but including being crass, being a bit harsh, being a bit offensive, having rough edges, that's Missouri. And so it was just really powerful to see how much I am a person of the Ozarks, no matter where I live. But really discovering it later in life, like, oh, well, that actually, no, I stripped away a lot of things, but that never went away. You can see Penny's just laughing because she got to meet my family and see some of my old friends and see all of their, like, this is my friend, the alcoholic. This is the family where there are all these drug problems. It's like, it's all there. It's all a mess. It's rural United States, and yet it's Ozarks, and the Ozarks is something else. Just like people from Chicago know that Chicago is a thing that's not like the Ozarks, and the same thing for being a New Yorker, like Gail is, like, that's definitely not the Ozarks. That's the New Yorker. You're like these stories of place. They become really fun in this way of like, oh, that little quirk about you is actually from your culture and it's actually from your place. But until I visited that place and saw that the people are kind of like that, I didn't know it was a story of place. I just thought it was a story of you. And so there's something about like how Earth regenerators started visiting each other. It was one of the moments when I felt like real community was happening was, oh, wow, Benji went to hang out with Connor, and Max and Sarah traveled all around, and all of a sudden Gail's receiving people from Earth regenerators, that sort of stuff that was happening. Now there's this next level. Well, what if you go together with someone to the place they were from and experience their story of place? So not what is the bioregion we're regenerating, but where are you from? Like, I want to go to where you're from, which, when you're in a life partner relationship like we are, it makes sense that Penny would enjoy coming and seeing where I'm from and knowing my family, but we don't normally think of that level of depth about our friends, certainly our Zoom buddies, the people we got to know online. But to go back and say, oh, Stephen, I'd love to go with you to New Jersey so I can know you better. Like, we don't think this is a bioregional education through our personal relationships. Like I could only imagine, Claire, what it would be like to go to South Africa with you. All the things that would evoke and how emotional and intense and intimate it would be, but how beautiful it'd be to know you as your friend. So it just gives us a whole different way of thinking about bioregional education. And what I keep finding is that bioregional education is not only multifaceted, it's multi-directional. It goes in many directions. So going with your friend to where they grew up is an example of that. I guess we're not ending yet because Rita raised her hand. So Rita, jump on in. Here you go.
Thanks. This is an amazing conversation, and it reminded me of a book I read a while back about American nations, history of the 11 rival regional nations, how people came and settled in America and also in the southern part of Canada, and how they arranged themselves in regions. And a lot had to do with where they had come from and how they felt connected to the land. So thanks for that. Very, very interesting conversation. And there's so much more to say, but I'll just say, love you all, and amazing things are happening. Wow.
Thank you, Rita. And I see Stephen has been prompted. So Stephen, jump on in. Oh wait, I can't hear you for some reason. Are you muted? Well,
There
there you
there
are.
now? Yeah, I have a secondary microphone I turned off. Well, you're talking about visiting, and I'm just, that would be the ideal, and obviously a lot of us don't have that opportunity. And there's just telling the story, sharing the stories like you've been doing. Is as you were sharing yours, or people were sharing whatever, I'm like, oh my gosh, how could I forget? Because I've told this story not that long ago about how as a child, I don't know, early teenager, I helped build an aquaponics, a wind-powered aquaponics garden in the solar-powered education center in my town. That was triggered by saying, oh, what would I show Joe if I was to take him through my town? And so there's this whole nature preserve called the Great Swamp in New Jersey, one of the early ones, and was well known for something of being larger. I don't remember what it was. So even just the conversations like this, something to do at campfires if people attend the campfires. That was because I'm thinking of that whole thing. It's like, gosh, I'd love to travel everywhere, and that conflicts with a lot of things these days. There's certain travel that may be necessary, but going to visit all my Earth Regenerator friends does not seem to really serve Gaia the way that you're traveling to Toronto does.
One thing that I'm seeing in this is that as we start to get clearer about what a design school is for this kind of learning, which is to basically look back and recover. Like one of the things that occurred for me last week was I realized that there were pedagogical threads in Earth Regenerators that have become invisible. Because I was thinking about pedagogy for a design school for Earth Regeneration, and that prompted me to think, I remember when Pamela Woodland was like, I'll design the cover of your book. And then she's like, I'll take over production of your book. And then she formed a marketing group, and then she recruited Claire. Hi, Claire is here now. And then all kinds of things happened. And there was a pedagogical process with Pamela's leadership that is now lost in the sense that we're all focused on other things and it just doesn't come up. It's not lost as in, no one remembers. The people who were involved would remember, but it was actually a pedagogical thread, which shaped Rachel Olson later writing a book and publishing it with the Earth Regenerators Press, which was a fake name we created for my book. And now Earth Regenerators Press has 2 books because we self-published them. And that was a pedagogical process that's part of the School of Earth Regeneration. And one thing that I'm bringing back into the fore from my own life, even before Earth Regenerators, is I have a long history of synthesizing knowledge across fields, of finding the story that enables that synthesis to occur. And the two biggest synthesis times, those moments in my life, were Earth system science, which integrates all the knowledge of the dynamic Earth, and cultural evolution, which has the potential to integrate all of the cultural, social, behavioral, ecological sciences with all of biology. Because cultural evolution is animal behavior for humans, and then animal behavior for birds, and animal behavior is a subset of biology. And so you end up finding that they all integrate. And so what I'm seeing is that having a design school would be to say, well, where would you go to learn this synthesis of knowledge? Where, you can't do it at a university, it's too siloed into departments. There are attempts within research centers and things, but not at this level, and certainly not integrating theory and practice, where we don't just learn it to learn it, we learn it while we're regenerating landscapes because there's no time to waste. And that's what we were talking about with bioregional learning centers and the bioregional catalyst conversations about story of place and et cetera, et cetera. It's all over our conversations. It's already existed in many ways, but we need to bring it back into structural coherence. And for me, it was realizing that the dynamic Earth actually contains all of it. If we studied the Earth as a living planet, we encapsulate all of it. All of human history is a tiny subset of cultural evolution, which is a tiny subset of animal behavior. Animals are a tiny subset of evolution, and on and on and on. And so, like, most people don't know that 90% of animals have exoskeletons, and mammals are only 3% of animals. And so the story of animal behavior is mostly the story of insects and mollusks. Things like that most people don't even know. They don't even know it. And most of history of life on Earth is bacteria. 90% of Earth's history was only bacteria and nothing else. Most people don't know that. And so to tell the story of the living Earth actually puts it all together, but only if we tell it through our landscapes so that humans can understand it, because humans can understand evolving landscapes. And so I'm just feeling this presence of what replaces universities if humanity survives. What replaces universities is going to be organized around the living Earth. And so, and by the way, some of you know that for the last 20 years, I've been involved in various moments of trying to create research and education paradigms for all these things. I've just connected with other people doing it, but it sort of fell away in the Barichara work. It sort of fell away in Earth Regenerators, but it's like, it needs to be born somewhere, meaning it just needs to thread all the existing pieces because there are so many of them. So holding that as an awareness that what I wanted to convey today was that you can see, I can show my almost 6-year-old daughter what we're talking about. Elise turns 6 the day after tomorrow. So my 6-year-old daughter can learn this. There is pedagogy, but it is immersion in landscapes. We have to travel to the Ozarks. We have to travel into landscapes. And so I'm really curious now, like Rita, I'm really curious what's going to happen for you when I go to Toronto for your Ontario connection. Just like these very personal stories, what it's going to bring up, and which I hadn't really thought of that until now. I'm really curious about your stories as a little girl in Ontario. What am I going to learn after being there in this lens?
Yes, I'm so excited for you. Yes. And I'll be there. I'll be following right along.
Yeah. Stephen, I just wanted to ask, is it something quick or important just for the sake of time?
I'm sorry, I didn't put my hand down.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I want to be mindful of time for everyone. I thank you for clarifying that. So I'd like to close by just saying, thank you for letting me share some of my story with you. I can tell that this way of role modeling how to tell stories is going to become more important. Not just me role modeling. Some of you know Penny's story in the Project Incubator last year, of how we tell our stories now changes things. Penny's sitting beside me largely because she told her story in the Project Incubator on Earth Regenerators last year. So how we tell our stories really does change things. And that as we do this work moving forward, I think it's going to become even more clear how our stories are going to become interwoven with each other. Where there'll come a point where, like, I won't be able to tell anymore which part of the story is mine and which ones was Benji's because of the way Benji and I have been collaborating, which we can already see happening. And that as we weave across bioregions, we're going to lose ourselves to the stories, but in the best way, like how we lose ourselves when we fall in love. And that there's something about falling in love with the children of the earth that'll make it possible for the earth to keep her children. That if humans don't go extinct, if humans survive what's happening, it's because we find our place in the earth's story. And some of us, our indigenous wisdom holders, they never lost that story. But to place it in this planetary context is new. And there's an opportunity to all come together in it. And so I'm just really curious, what's going to come next as Penny and I get to visit some of your landscapes in the coming weeks. So we're going to see Jonathan and we're going to see Preston and we're going to see Brian and Susan, which is the landscape that Rita's from. And we're going to get to feel some of that. I'm already curious about how it relates to the River Thames, as Richard and I had talked about in England, and how these landscape stories are so powerful for all of us. And as we're shaping a journey into Cowichan and Salish Sea, which I spent a third of my life in Cascadia. So it's really gonna be interesting to experience that anew. I recall watching Jan talking about the Kananaskis and place I biked through, and I could feel a deep connection with those amazing mountains. There's just something, that is coming into being. And it's happening fast. In the last 3 months, we have touched most of North America through indirect linkages, which is really interesting to just feel how the story is connecting us, even if we aren't physically in the same places. The story shows us how the Canadian Rockies connect to the Central Rockies and somehow to the Salish Sea. And, similarly for the Colorado Basin connecting to the Southwest. And that the Great Lakes connects to so many things, including the Hudson Valley in New York. And so it's just all coming together. So thank you all. Looking forward to more, and onward, fellow humans.